what we've seen in the religious Zionist discourse over the last 2.5 years since the war started is this joy and celebration of destruction. All right. And that is something that we should be profoundly, profoundly concerned about. Because again, Rav Moshe Amiel, famous religious Zionist leader, chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, he says there might be times, rare circumstances, where we have to hate somebody. But what he says is that mitzvah becomes immediately invalid the moment you enjoy it. Because the moment you enjoy hating somebody, even if it's the enemy, even if they halachically might deserve it, is that it has a corrupting influence on you.
I'm Scott Kahn, and this is The Orthodox Conundrum. This is The Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. I'm joined today by Rabbi Zach Truboff and Daniel Goldman to talk about the changing discourse in the religious Zionist community. But before we begin, I want to frame this conversation carefully. You might even call it a trigger warning of sorts, because I suspect that listeners are going to react to it in very different ways. This is not a discussion coming from outside the religious Zionist world. All of us are speaking from within it, from a place of commitment to Torah, to Zionism, and to the responsibilities that come with Jewish sovereignty. And it's not a debate about whether Israel has the right or obligation to defend itself. We all agree that of course it does. What we're trying to examine is something else. We want to talk about discourse, about how we speak, how we think, and what feels legitimate to say within our community right now. Over the past couple of years, and especially since the war began, many people have felt that something has shifted. The language has changed. The tone has changed. The range of acceptable views has changed. And not everyone sees it that way. There are many thoughtful people who would say that nothing essential has changed at all, or that if it has changed, it's changed exactly as it should have. That reality has changed, and the threats we face have changed, and our discourse has appropriately adjusted. Some would even argue that what we're seeing now is a healthier, more honest, or a more necessary way of speaking about power, security, and morality. And that's part of what makes this conversation difficult. Because this episode is not simply presenting one obvious problem with an obvious solution. It's raising a challenge, a way of looking at our current discourse that some listeners will find compelling, and others will disagree with strongly, perhaps even vehemently. The goal here is not to resolve that disagreement. The goal here is to surface it and to articulate it, and to ask whether we're still able as a community to hear perspectives that make us uncomfortable, especially when they come from within our own camp. So this is going to be a conversation that may push on assumptions. It may raise questions that do not have easy answers, and it may leave some listeners unsettled. But if we care about the health of our community, about the integrity of our moral and religious language, then this is a conversation worth having, and we'll get to it in just a moment. First, remember to subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please rate it and write a review. Continue the conversation on Facebook by joining the Orthodox Conundrum discussion group. Finally, the best way to promote your organization, your business, or yourself is to create a high-quality podcast, and JCH Podcast Productions can help you make that happen. Whether you want to learn how to start your own podcast or want to improve the podcast you already produce, we will make it happen. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. Daniel Goldman is a writer and community leader who's been active in religious Zionism in Israel for over 25 years. He is a former chairman of World B'nai Akiva and past board chair of Gesher, and currently chairs Leshem, which supports Haredi Yeshiva high schools. He writes regularly for the Jerusalem Post and Fathom Journal, where his recent long-form essay examined the mystical theology of Rav Tau, Neo-Kahanism, and Smotrich's decisive plan, which together underpin religious Zionism's current political representation. He was among the initiators of a public declaration by B'nai Akiva alumni condemning the recent rise in Jewish violence in Judea and Samaria. Originally from the UK, he has lived in Israel for over 30 years and is based in Beit Shemesh with his wife and 5 children. Rabbi Zachary Truboff is the director of the International Beit Din Institute for Agunah Research and Education. He is the author of Torah Goes Forth from Zion, essays on the thought of Rav Kook and Rav Shagar. His most recent book is Zionism in Crisis, Jewish Power and Moral Responsibility After October 7th. Before making Aliyah, he served as a synagogue rabbi in Cleveland, Ohio, for nearly a decade. He lives with his wife Jen and 4 children in Jerusalem. Rabbi Zach Truboff and Daniel Goldman, thank you very much for joining me today on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you, Scott.
I want to frame this conversation carefully before we begin, because this is not a discussion coming from outside the religious Zionist world. It's not a debate about whether Israel has the right or obligation to defend itself. We're all, I believe, on the same page about things like that. We're speaking about the community from within the community. We believe deeply in Torah, in Zionism, in Medinat Yisrael, and in the responsibility that comes with Jewish sovereignty. So what I'm interested in discussing today is something a bit more subtle. Not so much about policy as about discourse. Not necessarily what decisions are being made, but how we discuss them, how we talk about them, how we think about them, and what kinds of voices are welcomed and which ones are pushed aside from within the community. So this is going to be more about description and diagnosis than about condemnation. We want to try to understand what's happening in a movement that we care so much about. So Zach, let me start with you. Based on how you see things from within the religious Zionist world, how would you describe the tone, language, and assumptions of today's discourse?
Thanks, Scott. So I think I actually want to begin with an image from the midst of the war itself. And in a certain extent, I want to say the war is over. Part of me obviously wants to say the war continues because we still have no idea what is to come next. But there was a particular image from the war that has stayed with me very dramatically. And I saw it as I walked past one of my children's schools. Many of the schools here in Israel, they put out banners out front that said Am Yisrael Chai. And what I noticed that somebody had handwritten in on the banner, it said Am Yisrael Chai, and then somebody wrote in Al Harbo. Am Yisrael Chai, Al Harbo. The people of Israel live by the sword, right? That's essentially what had been added to it. And that image was very striking because it was put on a poster, so to speak, right outside of school, right? Not the kind of place you might think to see that. It was also up there for a long time. It wasn't like it was just one day somebody took it down. It was there for weeks, if not months. Maybe people didn't notice it. It was a little bit around the corner, but it was there for quite a long time. And when you see that line, Am Yisrael Chai al Harbo, right, it is a specific reference to the blessing that Esav receives, right? That Esav is the one who lives by the sword, right? That's Esav's bracha. That is not supposed to be the Jewish people's bracha. If anything, the idea that the Jewish people have to live by the sword would mean we've become like Esav. It's more of a curse, if anything. There's actually a midrash that says God wanted to give the Torah to all different nations. And when he brings it to Esav, Bnei Esav, they basically say, well, what's in it? And God tells them, they look at the mitzvot, they see lo tirtzach, they see don't murder. And once they see that, they're like, yeah, we don't want that Torah because we're, al harbo. That's what we do. That's kind of our thing, right? So seeing that in the midst of the war was very, very hard for me. And it captures something about the ethos that has, I think, suffused a lot of our communities, is that if we have to live, we have to survive, it's going to be through force. It's going to be through violence. And by using a Torah verse there, they're essentially sanctifying it, but doing it in a way that seems to not in any way be self-aware as to what's really behind it and what the cost might be with that. The other image I want to just give alongside of that, because I think it's still one that religious Zionism is carrying very much now, is over the course of the war, I went to a lot of funerals. I'm sure you guys went to a lot of funerals. And I've been a rabbi, I was a rabbi for a long time. I did a lot of funerals, probably hundreds of funerals. These funerals were unlike any others that I had been to because they were all tragic. They were all profoundly tragic. There were basically 2 categories of funerals. There were the young men, ages 18 to like 22, 23, the very beginning of their lives, dying in the war. And then the other group was what I would say young fathers, mid-30s to I'm 45, so like to my age, right? And it was also profoundly tragic. These are fathers who are dying, leaving behind a host of children who are going to grow up without them. And to be at those funerals and to see the willingness and self-sacrifice of individuals who had everything to lose and still went out to defend the Jewish people when they felt it was necessary, when they felt they were called, right? It's hard not to forget that. And those 2 pieces all together, right? The sense that we're going to live by the sword, but we're not going to necessarily pay attention to the cost. And we're still haunted by the sacrifices that were made. And religious Zionism made more sacrifices than many others. And those sacrifices weigh heavily right? There's a sense that the war had to mean something, it had to accomplish something, that violence has to have made us safer. And all of that, for me at least, still feels very much unresolved.
Before I get to what Daniel has to say about that same idea, Zach, I want to push back on 2 points to hear how you would answer them. The first one is when you talk about the al-harbo, by the sword, and you conflated 2 ideas. You said by force and by violence. And at least as I understand those words in the colloquial understanding, they're different things. One of them says force is necessary, and we live for 2,000 years without any ability to live by force or to have force behind us. And the result was persecution and death on a mass scale. Whereas violence, at least as I understand the implication of the term, implies something that might be a little bit more wanton and not in the context of doing it legally necessarily. Violence has that same implication, maybe the difference between killing and murdering. So I don't know if necessarily saying al-harbo, admittedly with the biblical allusion there, referring to Esav being somewhat troubling, but living with force, a lot of people would say, we don't want to live with force. But over the past 2,000 years, we saw the consequences of not living with force. And in an as yet unredeemed world, a world where we can't be the person that we want to be, the nation that we want to be, that doesn't have to live by force, better to live by force and survive than to live without force, be moral exemplars as we would want to be, and then to end up dying. By the way, I in no way mean to imply that using force is inherently immoral. That's not what I am saying. I mean that in our ideal world, we'd live in a world where force wasn't necessary because people would leave us alone. I'll ask my second question after you respond to this.
So the first thing I'll say, again, I'm a religious Zionist, but the emphasis is on the religious, piece. I'm looking at your screen behind you, and you have many Sfarim, right? And I have many Sfarim behind me. They're blurred out. I imagine Daniel also has many Sfarim around him, right? We don't have swords and guns behind us, all right? And there's a reason for that. Because when the question ultimately comes as to what is it that enables the Jewish people to survive, the answer is not the M16. Like, it just isn't. Like, I can't be a religious Jew or rabbi and claim otherwise. So I want to note that first and foremost. Doesn't mean violence doesn't have a place, or force doesn't have a place. We have to live in a state with an army. Like, I'm not, delusional anyway whatsoever. But I think it's a question of what defines us. It's got to be Torah, or it's nothing for me, right? The second point I'll make there is that the language on that banner is a question. Again, you started with discourse, right? What are the words we use? What are the words we see around us? And the words we use and the words we see around us reinforce a certain atmosphere about what becomes normative, what we expect, the way things should be. And for me, at least, seeing that Am Yisrael Chai and the addition of Al-Harbo, right, gets at something very deep and very problematic, because at the end of the day, again, it's a religious Zionist school, religious neighborhood. We're basically saying that we live by becoming Esav. There's no other way to understand that. We're taking the verse and basically, putting that in there fully. So to me, there's a dramatic slippage, a dramatic confusion, if that's what we're saying, and that's what we're putting out there in the midst of what is the most difficult time that probably any of us have ever experienced, and the state of Israel itself may have ever experienced since its beginning.
Then let me quickly ask, again, before getting to Daniel, very briefly, in terms of the second point, which I largely agree with. Let me point out that I'm playing somewhat of devil's advocate here, although not entirely. Part of the fear I have, and this is not so much an intellectual fear as an emotional fear, is that by emphasizing this idea of these young fathers and these young men who tragically were killed in war and saying, what was the point? Because did it really get us anywhere? While that's a very important question to ask, the flip side of that is implying that they died for nothing, which is a horrible thing for us to contemplate. And obviously, if it's true, it's true. I don't think it's true. But I sometimes worry that when we talk about the problems of force or the problems of violence, we end up in some level unintentionally, certainly unintentionally, discounting the sacrifice they made, saying, we're not safer because of them. In fact, we're just where we were before, and therefore their deaths meant nothing. What would you say if someone were to say that to you?
So when I gave those examples before, it was more so to describe the kind of weight that one feels. Meaning, I was at those funerals. I assume you guys were at those funerals. The feeling of that moment, when you see the children of the young father crying, when you see the parents of the young soldier crying, is that you feel that weight, right? And that's a weight, that's an absence that does not easily get filled. And it should not easily get filled. I'll use one example here of Shagar, who I've written about. He fought in the Yom Kippur War. He was called up on the second day. He's in a tank unit. He goes to the Battle of Nafach and the Golan. The moment he enters the battlefield, the tank is hit. Rav Shagar manages to get out of the tank. His two close friends were in the tank. They died. And Rav Shagar himself is left with grievous wounds. He has to go heal in the hospital for numerous weeks. After the war, Rav Shagar says that people told him, you got to have a Sudat Hoda'ah. You survived, right? This is important. You got to give thanks to God. And he says, I can't do that, right? Because to give thanks for his own survival to God would on some level mean, he says, saying that their deaths, the deaths of his friends, was somehow justified or part of God's plan. And he's just unwilling to do this, unable to bring himself to do that, right? There's a void that is there that puts tremendous weight. And I think part of the challenge is that the need to justify that void, right, means being able to say confidently, concretely, right, this did everything that we wanted to do, right? That's a pressure that we feel. Now, I don't know what this has fully done or not done. I think in some ways it has made Israel safer. In other ways, it has created new problems, but that's the nature of war. But all I'm trying to say is that it's still unresolved, right? The sense of what we've done, what we've achieved, what we haven't achieved, what are the problems we've solved, what are the new problems, those remain open to us. And as long as that remains open, the question of the sacrifices also remains open. And I think in the context of the community, there's still very much a sense, like you said, people want to be able to say concretely, okay, it was what they did was worth it. What they did was self-sacrifice. There's no question about that. What the meaning of that will be ultimately, none of us or God can fully answer that question.
Okay, thank you, Zach. Let me move on to Daniel and ask you what you think about these ideas we've said until now. And let me add to that an additional point. For people who may not be familiar with exactly what we're talking about, perhaps English speakers living outside of Israel, could you also add maybe your impression of what might surprise them if they understood what was being said in Israel in Hebrew that they may not have heard?
So, first of all, I think the example actually of Rav Shagar that you gave, Zach, is a really powerful way of describing it, because bear in mind, with the both, I think at the moment of 73, although it felt very calamitous, those who went to the Golan and fought and were either injured or were killed, it was very clear and obvious that response to the Syrian invasion in 73 saved the northern part of Israel. It's black and white. Rav Shagar absolutely knew that when he had this terrible personal dilemma as to make the, Sudat Hodaya or not. And I think the issue is not necessarily were we successful in the war. At a very personal level, the issue is, can I be, give thanks about myself when I know that my brothers in arms, or literally brothers or whatever, have not been so lucky as I am. And I think that sense is powerful. I don't know if you guys saw yet the Haben Yakirli with Rav Tamir Granot and Rav Midan. It's this documentary which the public broadcaster just they released on Yom HaZikaron last week, and it's about again, I'm sure some of your listeners will know them, but Rav Midan is Rosh Yeshiva in Har Etzion, and Rav Tamir is Rosh Yeshiva in Orot Shul in Tel Aviv. Rav Tamir lost his son very early on in Lebanon, a few days after the beginning of the war, and Rav Meidan, the son, was critically injured, lost both his legs in Gaza, and of course he felt the deep pain of losing a large number of students who were killed and wounded in the war. And I think they speak exactly the way that the gravitas that they give to the issue of war and the responsibility of sending either children or students, Talmidim, out to war. There's just no flippancy. There's just no taking that lightly. And I think if I'm sort of reading and listening carefully to what Zach is talking about, the words I would use is like, we see the use of terminology around force and what we should be doing with it in an extremely flippant manner, often used for completely populistic gain or marketing, if you will, political PR. And for me, that is a great sense of concern that is reflective on the community. I want, though, to step back and maybe think about the language that we're talking about in terms of the religious Zionist overtone window, right? Where have we been, and where are we going in terms of what is considered to be normal language? And for me, I think what has happened in the last 10 years in terms of concrete events. Number one, we have Bezalel Smotrich basically creating rebranding, basically religious Zionism in his own political image. And at the same time, or at least a little bit later, more or less at the same time, we have Ben Gvir bringing, let's call it either neo-Kahanism or maybe just good old-fashioned Kahanism back into the religious discourse and the political discourse. And I remember when that happened, my first reaction was at the Friday night table. My kids obviously have been through the religious Zionist education system, and there's a kind of spectrum of things that you expect them to hear about in school. Classic, neo, fringe, not fringe, whatever. But one of the things which is just an assumption up until that point, which is there is nowhere in the regular religious Zionist school system, in the education system, where Kahanism is a choice. Okay, it was muktzeh, right, out of bounds. And suddenly, because of a very specific political constellation, I now have to begin on a Friday night assuming that we may have to discuss why we don't like Kahanism, right? And so immediately, really without anything have happened, suddenly there is a kind of shift in the overtone window in terms of the educational discourse or the values discourse. And obviously that has a dramatic effect. The second thing, so that those are two meaningful, and if we have time, we can certainly get into how Bezalel Smotrich has really shifted quite dramatically, I think, what was already a fairly powerfully right-wing community into something which is much more specific within that right-wing spectrum. The second event, which I think has been very powerfully used to shift the dialogue, is the troubles in 2021, Shomer Chomot, okay, which again, I'm sure most of your listeners and viewers will be familiar with, when there was also conflict with Hamas, and in parallel, there was this Israeli-Arab uprising in some of the mixed cities where there was both an Arab and Jewish population, which I think was a sort of precursor psychologically to what happened on the 7th of October in terms of an event that had never really happened before in the state of Israel. And the rise of and the popularity of people like Ben Gvir really was not on the back of people adopting a Kahanist view of the world, but we need somebody who can take care of us. Okay, personal security suddenly became an issue, whether you're walking down the main street in Yafo, Lod, Akko, Beersheva, or wherever. And via the type of rhetoric, obviously, that Ben Gvir has been involved with for many, many years, he, I think, rode along that wave and has now become more popular, even politically, than the Smotrich himself. Okay, Smotrich is underneath the threshold to get into the next elections, whereas Ben Gvir still has 8 or 9. And as is self-evident, they both have ended up with very senior and extremely influential positions within the government. So I think without anything else have happened, those things have shifted what is considered to be normality in terms of political, which of course flows over into religious or moral dialogue, and that's my starting point for the discussion. And to a certain degree, after spending many years of social activism outside of the religious Zionist community, it was kind of that period of 2017 to 2021. I decided or realized that I couldn't leave the home base without being active, and I've been trying to figure out what to do ever since.
I'll just add to what you're saying, Daniel, that one of the wonderful characteristics, I'd say, and I use that term somewhat sarcastically, of the Israeli body politic, and perhaps it's true in other places too, but I'm speaking about what's home for us, is I find the tendency to really fall behind people who talk tough, regardless of their actual policies. In fact, I would say that Netanyahu's reputation is largely predicated on his ability to say what people want to hear as much as what he actually does.
And to be clear, Lieberman has ridden the same type of wave, and Bennett in his time has ridden the same type of wave. And now Ben Gvir is riding his type of wave. And to be 100% clear, the data and stats, specifically, since we're talking about our community, the stats under leadership of Ben Gvir and Smotrich is a catastrophe. Internally, in terms of the domestic violence and murders and things which are going on. And of course, these guys were in charge, along with the prime minister, when the 7th of October came along.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
And that's exactly my point. It's
Please
less
talk.
about them as it is about the fact that their polls, the way people look at them, is largely based on what they say and not necessarily on their record, which is a very frustrating thing for those of us who actually look at their record. Now, their supporters might disagree with me strongly and say, hey, you're wrong. Their record is what they say it is. That's for them to decide. But it seems to me, and I'm guessing to you, that their record is not equivalent to the way they talk. When Ben Gvir gets up there and talks about making the world safer, making Israel safer, practically speaking, I haven't seen him do that. Now, I want to speak a little bit about Rabbi Avraham Zarbiv. As I understand it, he's a Dayan who became well known as a reservist operating a bulldozer in Gaza. And he used very specific language in describing that experience, talking about it almost in messianic terms, as at least in part, as I understand from what you said, Zach, in a post you put up on Facebook, speaking about it as the continued revenge of Shimshon, of Samson, when he had revenge for one of his eyes. This might be the second eye that's being avenged. In any case, I'd like to talk a little bit about the fact that he's been embraced. He lit one of the torches on Yom HaAtzmaut, and the fact that he is an example of what religious Zionism has become is interesting. And full disclosure, I've spoken to some people whom I respect greatly who see no problem with what he said, because they're saying the people in Gaza, whose houses he destroyed, so to speak, again, I'm not getting into the moral details over here, but whose houses he bulldozed, even if they were not Hamas members, if they were Hamas members, then they deserved it. And even if they weren't, the idea is these are people who voted Hamas in and who, at least very largely by polls, support everything that Hamas did, even long after October 7th was shown to be a disaster for the Palestinian people. So people say that and I'm talking about well-meaning religious Zionist people, have said their sympathy for Palestinians whose houses were destroyed after they had celebrated the kidnapping of 251 people and the murder of 1,200 people, their sympathy is extraordinarily limited, and they don't mind language that perhaps 3 years ago would have sounded extreme, but now sounds justly deserved. So Zach, what do you say to that?
So my interest in the Zarbiv example, so to speak, actually comes from the fact that my oldest son learns at Yeshivat Orot Shaul in Tel Aviv. That is Rav Shirlo and Rav Tuer Gronot's yeshiva. And Rav Zarbiv first came into the news a few months ago because what had happened was people in the neighborhood of the yeshiva invited to have him speak at the yeshiva without the yeshiva even knowing that it was happening. Right? They were just sort of like treating the yeshiva like it's the local matnas or something. We're just going to hold an event there. When the yeshiva found out about
They were just using a room.
When the yeshiva found out about this, Rav Shirlo officially canceled it, and he posted on Facebook, and he explained how Rav Zarbiv and what he had done and how he had done it during the war didn't match with the values of the yeshiva. And maybe that was even less the issue in the fact that this was an unauthorized event. It was being sort of like forced, that yeshiva plans these things thoughtfully, and so it's going to be canceled. What was fascinating in that moment is that there was a huge uproar against Rav Shirlo, that Rav Shirlo had done something very wrong, either by besmirching Rav Zarbiv or by not letting Rav Zarbiv's voice be heard in that particular context. They were silencing him. They were censoring him, right? That was sort of the conversation around it. So that was where my initial interest came from. It also comes from the fact that I'm involved in Beit Din work. So the idea of there's a Dayan out there fighting in Gaza always had a bit of an interest for me. I was following him a bit the last year or two. And Rav Zarbiv became well known for, driving the D9 bulldozer. And it was part of a policy of demolishing buildings that could potentially be used for booby traps or for terrorists. And the idea is that if we just clear the buildings, it will make the soldiers more safe, right? Because won't have to go in and check them out, right? There'll be less opportunities for ambush, all of that, right? On the other hand, Rav Zarbiv was also well known for recording videos of himself, videos celebrating quite proudly about flattening Gaza, to the extent that his name became a verb. Lizarbev became a verb euphemism for we're going to flatten Gaza. He wanted to flatten Gaza, he's very clear about this, and create new settlements there, right? essentially very clearly ethnic cleansing. I mean, we can call it whatever we want, but it meant let's get rid of the Gazans. The Jews are coming back. And it was a joyous celebratory expression of this. There's a lot of videos of him on this. I think he might have even been on the Patriot team on Channel 14 at one point, right? And what happened is he was chosen to light the torch. Once again, that brought up a lot of concern for what he is and what he represents. What was so striking to me is that he gave an interview with Makor Rishon the week before, so basically a week ago. And in the interview, he says that he saw his actions of leveling Gaza as being part of the future messianic revenge that God is going to take on behalf of the Jewish people. Tells the story of Rav Goren. Rav Goren went to Gaza, maybe it was after 67, he's not totally clear. Rav Goren tells him the story that Samson basically was blinded. Essentially, we know this by the police team after he was captured by them. He basically asked God to take revenge on his behalf. God only took revenge on the one eye by bringing the house down, right? The future revenge for the Jewish people in Gaza will come as part of redemption. And Rav Zebib says that's essentially the revenge, the messianic revenge that he's playing out. He's driving on his D9, leveling the buildings, just like Samson did with God's help back, thousands of years ago. Now, what was fascinating is in that same review, Rav Zerbiv then goes on to say, but I'm not taking revenge. I'm just a soldier. I'm following orders. Right. And this has become, I would think, almost a distinguishing characteristic of religious Zionist discourse, is that there is a lot of rhetoric that is outright, joyfully proclaiming revenge and celebrating it. And then in the very next breath, just saying, well, what we're doing is for security. What we're doing is just to protect the Jewish people. We're risking our lives. It's necessary. Those two things do contradict each other, right? They don't really live together fully side by side. And to a certain extent, you have to ask yourself, which one is the real one, right? Is it the joy of destroying the enemy and celebrating that they'll never come back, and this is messianic revenge? Or is it I'm just a good soldier following orders? Now you can say it's both of them. You could say maybe it's the former, because the latter is just there to kind of give yourself some plausible deniability. But what it does is it creates a discourse where you can celebrate acts that many people think are actually a problem, the celebration, the joy is the problem, and then covering it up by also saying, but I'm just doing, the right thing. I'm just doing what I'm supposed to do.
So would you suggest, Zach, let me just ask about that.
Let me just, one last thing I'll say is that what we've seen in the religious Zionist discourse over the last 2.5 years since the war started is this joy and celebration of destruction. Right. And that is something that we should be profoundly concerned about, because again, Rav Moshe Amiel, famous religious Zionist leader, chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, he says there might be times, rare circumstances, where we have to hate somebody. But what he says is that mitzvah becomes immediately invalid the moment you enjoy it. Because the moment you enjoy hating somebody, even if it's the enemy, even if they halachically might deserve it, is that it has a corrupting influence on you. And what happens when you enjoy the destruction, but then just say you're following orders, you're a good soldier, is that you can't actually take responsibility for the joy and the corrupting influence that it has on you. And the last thing I'll say here, and this is the thing that I've been thinking about a lot, the Baal Shem Tov, as one of his teachings that's not as well known, but should be a lot more well known, is he says that the Yetzer Hara often appears to us as the Yetzer Tov, right? The evil inclination often appears to us as the good inclination, meaning it's the moments when we think we're actually doing something righteous and we're doing a mitzvah that we also have to be aware that we might be doing it for reasons that aren't so good, right? And I think religious Zionism, especially the last 2.5 years, that very question that the Yetzer Hara might appear as the Yetzer Tov, the most holy thing, might also be truly destructive and evil at times if we're not careful. That's a teaching that I'm not sure our community has been willing to be open to very much.
Then let me push back again coming from the perspective that what you say makes a lot of sense, particularly this idea that the problem is not so much the destruction, should it be necessary, but instead the celebration of such destruction, the joyous celebrating of destroying something. Now, taken out of context, that sounds like a very enlightened, noble, and moral attitude. Of course. But I also know that I've got a kid in the Army who's in his early 20s. And when you're in your early 20s, you're not necessarily theologically sophisticated. And in addition to that, I can imagine somebody saying to my son or somebody else who's in the Army, okay, you're going to have to go and shoot the enemy. But when you do it, you have to be sad. Obviously, oversimplifying over here. that will undermine his ability to do it with alacrity, to do it properly. When he does what he does, he should do it and say, this is what I have to do, and not to feel guilty about it, even if it is a mixed bag. I don't mean guilty because he did something wrong, but to feel there is a moral ambiguity in anybody, even doing an absolutely necessary killing is also something which corrupts us. For example, the executioner who kills somebody who has to be killed. Nevertheless, that person shouldn't be gleeful about it. But at the moment that someone is in danger and it's either kill or be killed, you have to put that aside and just do what has to be done. So, Zach, if I were to take what you're saying right now, I agree with it in principle, but on the battlefield, I think it's asking a lot for people to have that nuance in their heads. Now, admittedly, perhaps Rabbi Zarbiv should not take videos and celebrate in public, which is a different level. But in terms of the attitude of the average soldier, I'm not sure it's necessarily possible or even helpful for them to have that nuance when they're actually out there shooting somebody who's trying to kill them.
So look, that's a big question and a complicated question. And I want to point out I've not served in the IDF. I don't claim any specialized knowledge about what it means to have been in Gaza. What I'll say are two things. Number one, I'm not aware of any military thinker who thinks that having your soldiers regularly express gleeful joy at the destruction of what they're doing is good, right? If anything, there's been a lot of talk, and I mean, I've seen this, we've all seen this last 2.5 years, about how such sort of unrestrained expression is a sign of a lack of discipline among soldiers. That's been very, very clear. In fact, just last week or two, what was the big thing that was on the news, right? A soldier took a statue of Jesus up in Lebanon and was smashing it with a hammer, right? So that's not the kind of thing we typically had thought this is what goes on in the IDF before October 7th, right? But the loosening of discipline is a problem. I don't know how anybody else can describe it otherwise, but there's a deeper problem. It's one thing when people act undisciplined. It's one thing when I'm saying that enjoyment of destruction, and also Zarbiv's case, it's enjoyment of the enemy's suffering. And that, again, Zarbiv was enjoying the fact, he said this very openly, they celebrated here on October 7th, they're never coming home. Now we, can essentially feel good about that. The other point I want to make here is the videos, right? One of the things that became very common during the war were soldiers acting in ways that clearly violated basic codes of IDF, behavior. And it wasn't just that they were doing it. They were taking videos of themselves and sending it back for all of us to see, right? The exhibitionist dimension of the transgression, we'll call it, is not something to be dismissed lightly, because we know this, right? It's one thing to do things in the moment. It's another to take a video and want a lot of people to see it. And whether it was Zarbiv in Gaza, whether it was that soldier up in Lebanon, or the hundreds of other videos we've all seen of soldiers doing things that, again, it can't really be justified, right? The idea that they want to show that to other people means we've reached a point where wherever restraint was there, it can't even get them to keep it private, right? Normally when people transgress the rules in some way, right, they don't want to broadcast it everywhere. In the religious Zionist community, that kind of broadcasting has become more and more common. And I would argue it goes to the sense of wanting to celebrate again and enjoy the destruction, so to speak, that is happening. The last thing I'll say is that Rav Zarbiv is a dayan. He's a rabbi. He wears that hat. Whatever he does, couples are going to go before him for divorce in Ariel, where he's a rabbi. For him to take that on in that kind of public way and not to have for any moment really see that there might be a problem there, to me, that shows some, deep, deep concerns about his own judgment.
Okay, thank you. Daniel, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, first of all, the point about the fact that he is a Talmid Chacham, a rabbi, a dayan, I think just multiplies the responsibility that he ought to take for the way that he expresses himself. He became a star of TikTok. It's quite clear that his rhetoric went way further than just, I'm a good soldier and I'm doing what I'm being asked to do. Whether or not he himself is kind of navigating a fine line between sort of celebration, gaslighting, and just a kind of more natural sense of he's doing the right thing. The point is a responsible society can look at that and then take a view. And what was the invitation that Zarbiv received to light the Maswa on Yom Ha'atzmaut was not the, it's really great that he's a Talmid Chacham, and he's 50 years old, and he's got 10 kids, and yet he put himself in the firing line and spent hundreds of days doing Miluim. Okay, of course, he's not alone in having done that, but in many ways, he would have been almost a poster boy for that type of self-sacrifice. But he was invited because he also glorified the things that he was doing, and wearing the long coat and the hat and screaming out as he did at the ceremony. It expresses that aspect of it. And I think the issue is not so much Zarbiv, but where we are shifting in terms of, is the IDF's job to defend Israel, or is the IDF's job to carry out divinic vengeance? And what's quite clear, I think it's at all controversial, that Rabbi Zarbiv is saying, whether he's sort of in a kind of self-glorification way saying, I am the tool of this godly vengeance, or he's in a modest way saying, I'm just a soldier, and we can see God's vengeance on Gaza. Obviously the truth is in the eye of the beholder there. But what's clear is that within our own community, that dialogue with vengeance and how it should be carried out and whose job it is, and whether we can actually decide for ourselves when that happens, I think goes very much against the grain of a standard view, certainly from Israeli society in general, that sees the IDF as a professional people's army whose single task is to defend the security of the people of Israel. And if one group or another assigns to that army some type of divinic role, which they have appointed and almost given the prophecy to, then ultimately you're taking the commonality, that consensual view around our army, to a completely different place. And it's reflective, I think, of deeper trends which are happening within the community, which, if we get some time to talk about, are much less about where religious Zionism came from and much more about aspects of where they are heading towards. One final word. I have two boys who served in Gaza. One is a tank commander, one is in infantry. In particular, my son, who's a tank commander, was involved in destroying a lot of houses, and he was defending and protecting people with the Bagrim and the D9s, etc. That were, and I don't think in any sense his ability to carry out his role needed to be on the basis of feeling bad about what he was doing. Ultimately, he really was carrying out his orders. And I think we need to be really careful to make sure that, on the one hand, as you say, not to undermine their ability to do that, but on the flip side, our job as parents and educators is also to send them out, so that if some officer tells them to do something which they clearly believe to be illegal, okay, then they need to have the moral backbone in order to say, we're not going to do that. So it flips both ways in terms of how we're sending out the boys to carry out their really very, very difficult task.
Okay, Daniel, you said a lot, and there's a lot that I want to comment on. I especially want to talk about that idea of dialogue with vengeance, and we will get there. But before we do, I want to first ask, because I'm saying this on behalf of many listeners who might say, what exactly is the problem with having a messianic view of what the IDF is doing? Essentially, it sounds as though you're making it into a binary. Either the IDF is here as a practical necessity in order to protect Jews who live in the land of Israel, or it is an instrument of divine retribution, vengeance, or even just simply divine will that Israel become a messianic state. I know
Fantastic
that
question.
religious Zionism itself has many different aspects, but certainly today, the dominant aspect seems to be, and I don't celebrate this myself, but the dominant aspect seems to be the messianic strain within it, saying that we are at Atchalta de Gula, we're at the beginning of the redemption, and if the IDF acts as a redemptive army rather than as just the Israel Defense Forces, that's a good thing. How would you respond to that?
So I think if Scott Kahn or even Rabbi Scott Kahn from the pulpit said the IDF in the arc of history is playing its role in bringing closer to the redemption, I think that's okay. I don't think there's a problem with that. I think you may even be entitled to a view that says we ought to have a much more aggressive security policy, because if we take over Gaza and parts of Lebanon and Syria, then ultimately that will bring closer the redemption. I think that's also an okay position to hold, one I may personally have a problem with, but I don't think that, and that's fine. I think when you are in uniform and you are in the midst of carrying out the activity, you are putting yourself up against all other members of the IDF who may not feel the same way as you do. And the core function or the core ability, the characteristic that allows the IDF to act is that we have people from the left, we have people from the right, we have people who are religious, and we have people who are secular, and we have people who are religious who see their Zionism as something mystical and messianic, and we have religious people who see their Zionism as something which is purely political. And the moment which is why, of course, it is completely out of bounds in general for soldiers, whether they be officers or just regular soldiers, to use the platform of being in the army, miluim or regular, and certainly in the professional ranks, to use that platform for political opinion, and saying that the reason why we are flattening, surfacing all of Gaza is so that Palestinians can't come back and Jews are going to resettle in Gaza. These are highly political messages, and they should be left to Daniel Weiss or whomever, and not in the army. And that's why Zarbiv should not have been picked for the Masuah, over and above the other concerns that Zach quite correctly relays, which is this kind of glorification of the violence itself.
Zach, would you like to comment on that too?
Yeah, so I want to pick up on 2 points related to this. So I want to go back to this idea of Rav Zarbiv is almost like we said Davidic vengeance, right? Rav Zarbiv has been compared in the religious Zionist community to King David, because King David is somebody who combined Torah study and the willingness to fight, right? King David is the model of somebody who brought the two together, right? Yeshivat Hesder student, the one who studies, but the one who also fights. Now, what is a bit striking to me is that, and I brought this, is that Rav Yehuda Amital brought up many times a particular teaching of the Rambam, which is more than a little bit ironic in relation to Zarbiv. It is a teaching of the Rambam in Shemona Prakim that raises the question as to why God prevented David from building the Beit HaMikdash. Now, the Tanakh actually gives us an answer to that, right? God basically tells David in Divrei Yamim, right, that it's because of the blood that he spilled, right? It's not totally clear whose blood is it. It's the blood from those in the wars. Is it Uriah's blood? We're not totally sure. But what the Rambam says is that we have to understand as follows. David was a righteous person. We know that. He did sin and he did tshuva, but David was still a righteous person. But what happened is that even though his fighting was justified, even though he was fighting enemies of Israel and showing kindness to the Jews, it didn't matter, because somebody who fights like that and fights like that in their life inevitably develops the midah of achzariyut, right? The attribute of cruelty, right? And that was the reason why David could not build a base of Mikdash, because his experiences in war, fighting in war, makes you cruel. That's not my words. That's the Rambam's words. All right. So I want to hold that as point one, because when we look at Zarbiv and we see how he's acted and we see what he has said, it's not hard to say that cruelty is exactly that thing that he is demonstrating publicly over and over and over again. But there's a second part of this, which is the messianic part, right? David is often associated with Mashiach, right? Mashiach ben David. We know this. The problem, I think, with messianism, and I heard the way Daniel was talking, the way Scott was talking about it, is that there really isn't such a thing as a little bit of messianism. Part of what we've gotten a little too used to in the religious Zionist community is like Reshit Tzmichat Pulatenu, right? It's a little bit of messianism. Messianism is not something you can have a little bit of. It's like being a little bit pregnant. And the reason I say this is that Jewish history makes clear how messianism manifests itself. The two most famous false messiahs, right, are Jesus and Shabtai Tzvi. And what makes them both significant is after they clearly failed, after they clearly died, their followers still kept on believing, right? Each one, to a certain extent, led to the creation of new religions from the Jewish perspective. The problem with messianism is that it, by definition, requires you not to look too closely at reality. Because if redemption is coming, right, we should be seeing it. We should be experiencing it. And if you're acting in ways that are supposed to bring it, and it's not happening, and I hate to break it to everybody, after 2.5 years after October 7th, redemption still is not yet here, then to a certain extent, a messianic outlook requires you to deny reality. It requires you to be able to look critically at what you're doing. If you're acting messianically, it justifies anything and everything. Like, that is what history shows. We know this. And what concerns me before, as I said with Zarbiv and David we know could do tshuva. But the problem is, if you engage in this kind of behavior to the extent that you become cruel, the ultimate cruelty, I think, of what war does to a person long enough after enough time is that you cannot see what it has done to you. You cannot see what it has caused you to become. And personally, I am a bit fearful. We talked about the Overton window shifting, right? What can be said now that couldn't be said before? Part of that shift makes it that much harder to say anything self-critical, which means it makes it that much harder to be able to do tshuva if we've done something wrong, if we're going the wrong way. And messianism is probably the number one guarantee that will prevent a person from doing tshuva, right? Who's the third most famous false messiah in Jewish history? Probably the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Now we are 30 plus years after his death. There are still thousands of people who believe he's the Mashiach, right? It's very hard, even when reality is telling you otherwise, when you're in a messianic mode, to recognize that maybe what you're doing is not as real as you think it is.
This is a good time for me to mention the line which I often enjoy citing by Rabbi Norman Lamzatzal, when he said that he has a position called, which he calls, Messianic agnosticism, which is a way of saying, it's not that I deny the Messianic character of the state of Israel, it's that I don't know, and essentially no one else does either. There's no way human beings can possibly know that. And I don't know if you'll agree with me, but it seems to me that not being Messianic does not mean that we have to deny that there is a Messianic component to the state of Israel. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't, but it doesn't necessarily impose obligations upon us different from those we would have if it were not a messianic moment. Meaning, let God do what God's planning on doing. Our job is to be the best Jews we can, to follow the Torah, to build the best state we can, not under a messianic umbrella, which has all sorts of other assumptions that there's going to be a new Torah and a new way of doing things. Continue as we would, as if it weren't Mashiach. Yet Mashiach can still come regardless. Do you think that's possible, Zach, or do you think that's what you would call a little bit of messianism and is still invalid?
So here's a broader point. If you look at the Rambam in Hilchot Melachim in the last two chapters, the Rambam lays out clearly how the redemptive process is supposed to work, right? And what is very important for the Rambam is that he describes a process in which somebody has the presumption of becoming Mashiach, right? Geula does not begin before Mashiach for the Rambam. That's pretty clear, right? You have an individual who is the Jewish king, who acts in ways that might be indicative that they are Mashiach. And if they do certain things like bring people to Torah, they're successful in certain wars, they can have what's called the Chezkat Mashiach. They can be the presumption of Mashiach. However, if they die without having fulfilled the full messianic responsibilities, that means they are not Mashiach, and we know it, right? Part of the problem with thinking about the founding of the State of Israel as messianic is that it, doesn't map onto the Rambam at all, but that the Rambam is doing something very important, something he was very conscious of, is that messianism has to have an off-ramp, right? It has to be a point where you could say your messianism can be disproved. Because if reality cannot disprove your messianism, we know what already happens. The Rambam actually says it. Towards the end of the second last paragraph of Hilchot Melachim, he cites the example of Yeshua as an individual who was seen to be the Messiah, whose followers could not accept that his death meant that he wasn't the Messiah. Right? The danger with any kind of messianism is that, as I said before, you will keep seeing reality just the way you want, which means not looking at it as the way it actually is. And that's without even getting to how it might justify or legitimize certain behaviors. Because again, if you're going to bring Mashiach, how could we not justify anything if it's going to repair the world, right? If you're going to save the Jewish people. If you think you are in the role, and it was already said before, you think you are stepping into God's shoes at that point, right? It can justify anything and everything. And one of the dangers I worry about, I'm not a messianist when it comes to Israel at all. I'm in good company. Rav Soloveitchik, very clear. State is not redemption. Not. Couldn't be more clear about that. But one of my concerns is that we use messianism as a way of finding comfort when times are bad, and to a certain extent, not having to question ourselves when we face certain choices in the road about what decisions that we're making. That we use it, we might say, as a therapeutic, right? We're using it to solve certain problems for us in ways that make life a little bit easier, but we're not fully grappling with its true implications and the dangers that it can produce, and which it has produced, right? We're not special. Jews have had false messiahs before. The consequences are well known.
And I know Daniel wants to comment on this. Before he does, I just want to make one comment myself, which is that while I respect what you're saying, Zach, one point that I would disagree with, I think you may be conflating to a certain degree messianism and redemption. And again, citing people like Rav Yoel Ben Nun and Rav Lam, yes, messianism does refer to redemption, but not every redemption has to be messianic. In other words, we could say that Israel has a redemptive role in Jewish history, which is not necessarily saying or conflating it with a messianic state. So I myself want to try and separate those two things to say there is such a thing as redemption, maybe not the ultimate redemption. The very fact that we talk about Geula Shlema. Now, some people just say it's a matter of a tahalicha process and we're on the way, what you might call some messianism, but there might be something else, which is this is a redemptive moment, which is independent of and distinct from the final redemption too. I think that's also possible. The very fact that Israel has been the scene of kibbutz galuyot and, at least for many people, apparently the fulfillment of some prophecies in the Tanakh, even if not all of them certainly, would indicate that something is happening here, which is not simply practical and a means of getting Jews safer or something like that, but something which actually is redemptive, even if not directly related to the Geula Shlema.
All I can say, once again, we don't have time to fully get into all the dimensions of this, is that just like it's hard to be a little bit, messianic, it's hard to be just have a little bit of redemption. Right? The two are deeply tied together in ways that we often don't realize. I think that's also the part of the point you're saying, Scott, is that we often don't even necessarily internalize fully what the implications of different positions are and how even in all of us in certain moments slide between them. And that's the danger of it potentially. All I'm saying is that the Rambam is very clear, very much a halachist, right? He understood what messianism could unleash, and there has to be checks and balances, and there have to be off-ramps. From my perspective in our community, what I saw the last 2.5 years was the exact opposite of any kind of checks and balances on messianism or possibility of off ramps, and that's concerning for me.
Okay, point well taken. Okay, Daniel.
So I'll make just a couple of comments, and it's certainly not an area that I would consider myself to be, learned or scholarly. I think if we're going to make the argument. And this is about, overturn windows and so forth. If we're going to make the argument that religious Zionism has to do a reboot around its approach to messianism, redemption, and all of the various connections that creates, then we are upending some very deeply held religious and societal views. Anybody who grew up, I think even in the most left wing of Bnei Akiva groups, sees the writings of Rav Kook, both the father and of course the tectonic moment of Rav Tzvi Yehuda before the 6-Day War, talking about the places that we should go back to, and then it happening, and the power that unleashes. I think to completely. And I think I have some messianic anxieties, but perhaps that would be a good way to describe it. But I think that to sort of reboot around that issue is going to be very, very difficult. I will say also that I would challenge Zach to say, are you almost saying there's an inevitability? There can be no ethical messianism? Are we saying that ultimately there is an inevitability around a sort of theology around Israel doing the things that it has done, incoming of exiles, making the desert bloom, all of the things that are not just the writings of religious leaders, but the, Israel returning to history is a historic fact. it came to us in mother's milk in terms of as we are as Zionists. That is what, and especially as religious Zionists, it's like we're the people who came after the Romans and the Greeks and all this other type of stuff, and we're still here, and whoops, we've got a sovereign country back. I think that maybe the educational challenge that we have is to say all of those things are indeed historical fact, and we see God's hand, or we assume God's hand in those events because we are believing in religious people. And then in a sort of Rabbi Soloveitchik ways, what does that mean for me morally right now? It is not to take a view around that those sort of messianic events, but simply to say, what is my moral requirement? Should I act and behave within that? Maybe you see that as kind of two things that cannot live together. And as you said before, it's like you can't just be a little bit pregnant. But I think many people within the community who see themselves as standard mainstream religious Zionist people, leaders, rabbis, whatever, I think have as axiomatic the view that there is something messianic about the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. And then the challenge is, okay, does that mean that we have to become ethnic cleansers? Or does that mean we can actually take that moral declaration to a position of, no, actually we want to have a higher level of morality within that, rather than dropping down to some low level of barbarism, God forbid, not that we are. So those were a couple of thoughts that came to mind about the messianism, but it's beyond my pay grade a little bit to say one way or the other.
And I would add to that one more point, which is that when we say that messianism allows everything, I think, Zach, you're very right in terms of the popular imagination and in terms of the Amcha, perhaps. But I also think that we have a Torah obligation to always remember that the ends don't justify the means. And that's expressed, as I see in Parshat Nisavim, when it says, Hanistarot l'Hashem Elokeinu, the hidden things belong to God. Haniglot lanu ulevanenu ad olam, asot kol divrei Torah azot. However, the revealed things, meaning the eschaton, is something which is God's alone. What we have to do is to do the Torah. And if advancing the eschaton involves violating the Torah, then in that case, then we can't do it. That's not our job. That's God's job to bring the story to its correct conclusion. Our job is to follow what God said to do. But that actually leads to another point, which I think is back in our main area of discourse today, which is that too often values get flattened and simplified. And in fact, perhaps instead of values clarification, seeing that, for example, settling the land of Israel is a value, and preserving life is a value, and treating the stranger is a value, etc., we then take one value and have it run roughshod over everything else. That's part of the problem, in the sense that I might say very nice, and it's easy to say the ends don't justify the means, but someone says, I'm not. The means are said in the Torah. You have to take over the land of Israel. The problem there, I see it, is ignoring all the other values that may come in conflict with that. And instead of figuring out which one takes precedence, assuming that one, in our case, very often the most militant one, is always at the top of the scale of values. That's how I see it as a problem. Do you agree with me, Zach?
So I want to use this as an opportunity to reflect a little bit about what makes religious Zionism different from, let's say, like the Haredi world, right? And I want to use Rav Moshe Amiel again to do that. Again, leader of Mizrahi in his time, chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, 1935 to 1945. What makes Rav Amiel interesting is that he approaches religious Zionism from a Haredi perspective. And he doesn't fully ever really leave behind his Haredi perspective. He has smicha from Chaim Soloveitchik. He grows up, studies in yeshivas Lithuania, right? He's a Litvak. He becomes a community rabbi in Poland and then in Antwerp before he makes it to Israel. And while he becomes a Zionist, a religious Zionist, he has some very deep concerns about Zionism. And they're not the ones that we typically hear, but they're ones that our community should hear because it came from a leader of our community. And he's concerned about nationalism because he understands nationalism. Because if you were a Jew living in Europe in the early 20th century, nationalism was something you saw. Nationalism was something that you felt the burden of, right? Most anti-Semitism in the late 19th and early 20th century in Europe is a product of European nationalisms, right? Nationalist movements arise. The nation is what is central. Jews don't fit into the nation. Jews have to be excluded. Jews have to be oppressed. That is the pattern throughout Europe. And he lives through World War I. World War I is a moment where nationalism goes wrong. Nationalism goes very, very wrong. And the bloody consequences of it are seen in the trenches and the millions that are dead. And what Rav Amiel has a concern about when it comes to religious Zionism is that what nationalism always does is it puts the nation first, right? The nation becomes the center through which everything revolves around. And the reason he is very concerned about that is because to be a Jew means putting God and Torah at the center. Now, the difference between those two positions are that when God and Torah is at the center, the primary question you're asking yourself as a Jew is, what does God want? What does the Torah demand of me? Right? That's the question. That's what a frum Jew, however they define themselves in any time and place, should have as an orientation to who they are and what they do. But nationalism is a little bit different, because the primary question that nationalism asks is not, what does God want? What does the Torah want? It is, what is good for the nation? That's what Ramiel notes. And what he notes is that many of the values, the religious values that can become centered when the nation is primary, are ultimately values that are about the nation itself. It's not what God wants of us per se, it's what we think is good for ourselves, but dressed up in religious language. So when you talk about the inversion of priorities or the way priorities become skewed, it is very difficult for me not to see that as a reflection of the nation and the national interest being primary and becoming sacralized. And the consequences of that mean that certain religious principles get emphasized because they are about the nation. Where security and land are foundational principles of every nationalism. We should not be surprised that religious Zionism puts those at the center, because it is a form of nationalism, very, very self-consciously. Right? And I think religious Zionists, because we have a Torah and we do care about it deeply, can lose sight of what is getting centered. And I'll end on just one other note. Rav Amital says this, not Rav Amiel, but Rav Amital, formerly of Gush. Rav Amital notes that on Yom Yerushalayim, right, there are these flag parades that make their way through the old city. And he understands the significance of Yom Yerushalayim because he fought in 48. And you know what it was like for the Jews, for the Yishuv to lose Jerusalem, right? It was very difficult. 48 had a lot of successes, but they lost Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim Yer HaKodesh. It's where I live. It's the only place I want to be, right? Losing that was traumatic. Regaining that in the Six-Day War was a profound, profound moment. But what he notes is there's a fundamental failure that takes place on Yom Yerushalayim. It's not even getting into what we have today, where the flag marches turn into, violent or abusive or racist. That's a whole separate question. His primary concern was that what is it we take on the march on this day that is supposed to be of holy significance? He says we take the flag. We're marching around with the flag. He's like, why are Jews marching around with the flag? He says the only thing that would redeem that day is if we march through the streets of Yerushalayim with Sifrei Torah, because that's what we should be carrying. Right. And I think at a certain level, that example points at the inversion that can take place within any nationalist movement, and particularly religious nationalism, where the nation, the national interest is the center, and every religious law, value, or whatever can be read through that. And you lose pretty quickly, what does God want? What does the Torah want? And you lose even quicker sometimes is that we might have obligations that extend beyond ourselves, right, to other peoples, to other nations. Right? Because the first thing you're going to do if you're going to say your national interests are primary is that you don't have to be going out of your way for anybody else too much. Right? And we can always find halachic language to justify that. We all know that. Right? And that to me is where I see, the primary danger there.
In preparing this conversation, I prepared a list of approximately 15 questions, of which we've gotten through 3. So I'm actually going to ask you, if we can continue this conversation very soon in a part 2, because there's so much more I want to talk about, and we're running out of time now. But before we conclude today's episode, I want to ask you both about this dialogue of vengeance that Daniel mentioned earlier. I think it's very important. And I'm going to explain what I'm asking, because I'll put it like this. There are 2 simultaneous movements that I think are happening. One of them is the movement of discourse largely to the right, into stronger, more militaristic avenues, and the sidelining of views that are not in line with that. Meaning it's not only that more people are expressing more rightward views, it's also that less rightward views are considered beyond the pale or even heretical. To give a simple and simplistic example of something that happened to me soon after October 7th, I don't remember which politician it was, but somebody in, I believe it was Ben Gvir's party, at one point floated the idea of nuking Gaza. It was an absurd thing to say. And I wrote an article.
Amichai Eliyahu, who is a minister and a member of Ben Gvir's party.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. And
and the rabbi and the grandson of
chief rabbi, correct.
Our former chief rabbi.
Yeah. And the son of the current chief rabbi, Tzfat, I believe.
Of Tzfat's son, yes.
And when he said this, I wrote an article talking about how terrible this was. And fine, I don't think that's a controversial position. That Friday night, someone I know, someone who's a nice person and a good person and someone who knows halacha, saw me on the street after Friday night davening. And he said to me, and I'm probably quoting it, said, "Oh, I didn't know you were a leftist." Now, saying out loud that I don't think we should nuke Gaza and that it's an immoral position to take, calling me a leftist as a result, I don't mean that this person is representative of everybody, but this is not a well-known right-wing agitator in my community at all. Not at all. The fact that someone could even suggest that not nuking Gaza is a left-wing position such that I'm a leftist for saying that, to me demonstrates a profound shift. So I'd like to ask you both, as a way of concluding today, what do you think about what I said? Is that true that there are two simultaneous developments? Number one, that things are moving to the right. And number two, other positions that are not in line with that traditionally were part of religious Zionist discourse, are being sidelined or eliminated altogether. Daniel?
Yeah, there are two things which are, I think, happening simultaneously. Some of it relates, I think, specifically to Israel, and other things are really in context of what is happening within much of Western society or Western democracies. So undoubtedly, due to the political constellation of the last 10 years, the acceptability of extreme right positions, whether it's transfer, which is a fancy word for ethnic cleansing, the type of revenge dialogue that we've spoken about, the increase in violence in Yudav Shomron and Judea and Samaria, all these things have increased over the last 10 years, and they have ideological basis, meaning these are not things which have just happened out of the air. There are people for whom vengeance, even the idea that in order for us to have this messianic moment or redemptive moment, we need to actually have no friends and allies abroad. And therefore, what we do here is not just by accident to upset our friends and allies, but that's actually part of the redemptive process. So when you see a soldier destroying an image of Jesus in Lebanon, most people consider that to be an embarrassment. For some people, they consider that to be a positive move, not because particularly about the image itself, but because it engenders Israel will stand alone, and the introduction of things like Sparta to our political terminology recently. Okay, so that is definitely happening, and that is something as people with a platform, whether it's a community or a website or a podcast or writings, is something that the only way to beat a bad idea is to generate and propose a better idea. The second thing which is happening, which I think is empowering these messages, is that we are in a very strong wave of populism within almost all of the Western countries. And we could spend a series of podcasts thinking about that and how that is playing out. But it is certainly on the march. Populism is definitely on the rise. It's on the rise in the UK. It's obviously on the rise in the US. There are European countries which are dealing with populism in one way or another. And the classic move of the populist, obviously by its very nature, is to dumb down and simplify political arguments. First of all, them and us. Okay, so polarization is an asset for populist argumentation. And that if you're not with us, you're against us. And I have a solution for the problems that you are feeling. So that, and just to give a very concrete example, Ben Gvir comes to power partly because of the political constellation, and partly because I will be able to sort out the unrest the next time something happens inside Israel with the Arab community, because X, Y, Z, and he, purports to be able to solve that. The reality of populism, unfortunately, is that most times the political ideas which are proposed are indeed just populist ideas, and are generally very unsuccessful in actually making life better. That does not lead necessarily to the populist becoming unpopular, because I refer you to the previous comment was, well, it's not me, it's the Supreme Court or the elites in academia or the media, which is, again, and so on and so forth. So you have a kind of confluence of those two social trends which are happening at the same time, which I think is making it much easier to sell these arguments. And bear in mind, a lot of people feel very much that the moments around Shomer Chomot and the uprising inside of Israeli borders, and of course the terrible events of October 2023, all they have done have made us all much more susceptible to those arguments. And again, it's really crucial for us not to patronize people who are concerned about these things. They are totally real, and it's absolutely for real. They do deserve a proper resolution to personal security and national borders and how we deal with Hamas and Iran and Hezbollah and all these things. Absolutely. I am a patriot. I mean, maybe I'm even a nationalist. I don't want to be upset anybody, but I definitely have national feelings towards Israel. And I don't see how you separate the flag from sending my boys out to fight. And the fact that, you know, in between Yom Ha'atzmaut and Yom Yerushalayim, in my shul, the Israeli flag is flying next to the Aron HaKodesh. By the way, if you go to almost all American modern Orthodox synagogues, it's not just like that in Yom Ha'atzmaut and Yom Yerushalayim. Often it's there the entire year round. So it has become almost like a religious object, whether or not we have, you know, philosophical or even political problems with that as an issue. That is our reality. But can you pause between that and the extremism plus populism? I think that's the challenge in the moment that we find ourselves in.
Okay, Zach, let's conclude with you. What are your thoughts about this?
So I understand exactly why you were surprised that anybody would question that it was absurd. But I also think we misunderstand something fundamental about the logic of the war and the logic of every war that Israel often finds itself in. One of the things that was hard for people outside of Israel to understand is 3 months, 6 months, 9 months after October 7th, why was the war continuing, right? Israel had already degraded Hamas quite a bit. Yes, there was the issue of the hostages, but at least outside of Israel, there was the sense that the war could stop, they could get the hostages back at really any time. Whether that was true or not, that was the perception. And internally, there was a very clear sense that the war was not done yet, because as long as Hamas was there, as long as Hamas was in charge, as long as Hamas had the military capabilities, right? What was the language? It presented an existential threat to Israel. That was the language you heard from Bibi. That was the language you heard all the way down to the bottom, that we would have October 7th again and again and again and again if Hamas was not fully defeated. Of course, Hamas has not been fully defeated. We'll leave that aside for the moment. But here's what we have to understand. When something is presented as an existential threat, right, as if the state cannot exist, as if we cannot all be safe, if XYZ is a reality, then the question becomes, why isn't anything justified, right? What are the limits, right? Why does Israel have nuclear weapons if not for existential threats, right? Why can't we nuke Hamas? Why can't we nuke Iran, right? The whole point is that these are existential threats. We're supposed to be able to protect ourselves. That's the whole concept of self-defense. So I want to bring this point to a sharper edge with Rav Amiel again. And he was a figure, he was the chief rabbi in Tel Aviv during the Arab Revolt in 1936 to 1938, right? Which was a situation, probably for our terms, comparable to like the Second Intifada. There was violence from the Arab/Palestinian community towards the Yishuv, right? And they also were towards the British. And there was a big question about what the Yishuv's response should be to Arab violence, Arab terrorism. And there were, by the end of the revolt, there was at least 300 Jews killed, right? It wasn't a minor thing. It was a big deal, especially small population numbers. It was felt very, very, very viscerally, right? And the policy that the Yishuv landed on was called Havlaga, which means we'll defend ourselves, but we're not going to retaliate. But retaliate here is a specific connotation. I mean, we're not just going to go to the neighboring Arab village and kill a bunch of people out of the belief that that will prevent further violence towards us. Now, the right wing at the time, the revisionists, were the ones advocating for retaliation. If they're going to kill 10 of us, we got to kill 20 of them to prevent further violence. Retaliation was framed as a form of self-defense. Yes, you may kill some innocents, but it's to save more Jews in the long run. Now, Rav Amiel was categorically against this, and he was for a very particular reason that relates to your question about the using a nuclear weapon in Gaza or Iran or wherever. He notes that the concept of retaliation was used because it was said that the Jews won't be able to survive in Israel without it. It is only through this act of retaliation can we ensure our own survival. Our survival is what matters most. Therefore, it's justified even if it kills innocents, even if it purposely kills innocents. That was the logic. And Rav Amiel says, guys, you don't get it. He says, this is, again, his way of understanding that nationalism is the way it sort of takes over. He says every nation knows lo tirtzach. Every nation knows you're not supposed to murder people. Right? There's not a state on the planet where murder is legal. I hope we all know that. Right? But here's the problem. What every nation also thinks is that what matters most is its own survival. He says that's their kol Torah kula. At the end of the day, every nation will do what it needs to be able to survive because it's the most important thing to them. He said, for us, it doesn't quite work that way. He says there are limits. There are things we won't do. Because if there are things that if we will do everything, then God's Torah basically gets wiped out entirely. And he's particularly concerned that if we're willing to, in his language, murder innocents in order to save our own lives, that we have so fundamentally profaned the Torah and so fundamentally, compromised our souls that there is basically nothing left. And this is the challenge for him when it comes to innocence, right? Because there were innocents in Gaza, there still are. There were innocents in Iran, there still are. Is that at the end of the day, the test of whether nationalism is idolatry or not is whether or not you recognize that there are people who are not part of your nation who are created in the image of God, and that we bear some level of moral responsibility to them. Right? Because the challenge is when nationalism becomes the center, when the nation becomes the center, when the nation becomes God in his language, right? Then who's going to be in the image of God? Only members of the nation. Right? So on the one hand, he's saying the logic makes sense. If the survival of the Jewish people is what's most important, and our leaders were telling us our lives were all at risk, then anything can and should be justified potentially. On the other hand, if you think that way, you are fundamentally undermining, profaning on some level everything that the Torah stands for.
Okay, well, there's so much more I want to talk about, but we are running out of time right now. So I'm going to end here with the hope that we can continue at some date to come in the near future. So I'm going to thank you again, Daniel Goldman, Rabbi Zach Truboff. This has been very enlightening and very important. And thank you for joining me.
Looking forward to round two. Thank you so much. It's been really thoughtful for me. Thank you.
Yeah, Scott, you've been super thoughtful with your questions and framings. I really appreciate that.
I'd like to offer a word of thanks to our Patreon supporters. Patreon functions as a voluntary tip jar for Jewish Coffee House and our family of podcasts. Patreon supporters at all levels, as well as paid subscribers to Orthodox Conundrum Commentary, will have access to our upcoming private Q&A sessions. Your support in either place helps sustain thoughtful Jewish conversation. Additional bonus material, including the longer episodes with bonus questions, is available to paid subscribers of Orthodox Conundrum Commentary on Substack. No matter how you choose to support this work, we are deeply grateful. Subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in Orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. Subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Check out the link in the description of this podcast to get your free subscription today. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been the Orthodox Conundrum on jewishcoffeehouse.com.